All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, depending on what part of the world you are joining us from. I am Alex Faust, your host of Conversations at the Edge, and I'm very excited to have Mo Fathelbab back and joining us for Conversations at the Edge. If it is your first time learning from Mo, he is the founder and president of Forum Resource Network, LLC, and co-founder of Harvard Business School's Alumni Forums. He's the author of two best-selling books, Forum, The Secret Advantage of Successful Leaders, and The Friendship Advantage, 7 Keys to Building Relationships That Transform Culture and Drive Productivity. Prior to that, Mo served as the executive director of Entrepreneurs Organization, where he created the peer-to-peer forum program that initiated hundreds of CEO forums. And he's worked with over 20,000 CEOs and entrepreneurs over the course of nearly 3 decades in 33 countries. So he knows a thing or two about building relationships. And that's really why I wanted Mo to come back and dig in and talk about today. So I'm very excited for the conversation we have in store for you. As always, if you have questions, the last 10 minutes are reserved for you. So any questions that you have throughout the conversation, please type them in the chat, put them in the Q&A. I'll be sure to get them over to Mo. But with that, Mo, welcome to Conversations at the Edge. And where are you calling in from today?
Alex, thank you. Great to be with you. I'm right at home, Alexandria, Virginia.
Well, it's great to see you. Just north, located in sunny Philadelphia. Beautiful day today.
It is a beautiful day today.
And, the last time you were here with us, we talked about the power of our relationships. We talked about building a culture of belonging. And I want to go a little bit deeper on that and talk about some of the activities that foster those deep relationships. And so maybe we could start by just getting some background on your work and, where it stems from for the people in the audience who might not be familiar with you up until today.
Yeah, my pleasure. And it is great. I think this is our third time on doing this together. So really honored.
It is.
They say third time's a charm, right? Awesome.
We're getting good at this now.
We're getting good at this, exactly. So my introduction to this work came when I was executive director of the Entrepreneurs Organization, EO. And I worked there from 1990 to 1997. And first year I was associate director. Vern Harnish, for those of you that know Vern, hired me out of college. He was my entrepreneurship professor. And within a year, he quit. And so then I became executive director. But while I was there, we learned about this thing called Forum. And basically, it's a group of roughly 8 people who meet every month to help each other with anything and everything in a confidential, structured, non-judgmental environment. So I attended the very first training to learn how to do this in a way that's effective as executive director when YPO offered a program for us to finally attend, YPO being the Young Presidents Organization. And right away, I just thought this was incredible. I fell in love with it. I never felt, up until my tender young age of whatever it was, 23, I never felt such meaningful connection without being judged or attacked or questioned or it was the first time I truly felt like I was in a place where everybody was just being honest, open, real. And that spoke to my heart. So that's when I went on the journey to get this program spread throughout the organization, trained trainers to do it, did a bunch of it myself, and traveled to 30-something countries starting up these peer groups. And that was really my MBA is what I would say, because, certainly you make mistakes along the way and nothing like learning from experience.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. And, I know in one of your books, The Friendship Advantage, and we've actually been talking a lot about the new Gallup report that talks about the importance of having a best friend at work. And I'm sure you're not surprised, but maybe it's surprising for some folks in the audience. But can you talk a little bit about the importance of friendship in the workplace and how that's really impacting things like retention and performance for employees?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, when I started writing this book and started doing the research to find Gallup, that's a credible organization. So it's not my research, it's Gallup, saying if four out of people have a best friend at work, profitability goes up 15%. So, that's to speak to those people that are very hard-edged, business-driven, who want to see ROI on every dollar spent. But I think the benefits are even far bigger than that. So when you feel a connection at work, you feel a sense of community, and you spend, I don't know, at least 40% of your life at work. It's a big chunk of our lives. And so to be going to work and not feel a sense of community, in fact, is the opposite. That's when you don't feel like you belong, where you don't feel a connection, and it's just a job. And that's not fulfilling. And usually when that happens, people don't have tools to have difficult conversations. They talk about each other instead of to each other. And that results in some mistrust, bad feelings, and people then starting to be stressed about work, or work being the cause of stress in their lives. But when you learn to have meaningful friendships, and I'm not talking about, any casual friendship like somebody you just say hello and goodbye to. When you have meaningful friendships, now you have the opportunity to have real conversations about stuff that matters, whether it's, good news, whether it's bad news, or whether it's, oh, I don't really know how to do this task. Because not admitting your mistakes or inabilities to do something can cost the company a lot as well. But having a friend at work then makes it so you're happier, you're healthier, everything just flows from there.
So, an interesting thought just popped into my head. I'm curious if there is a distinction between like friendship and niceness at work, because I think sometimes we think, when you're with your friends, sometimes you don't want to have to tell them, the hard truths. And a lot of times in business, we have to deliver those difficult conversations. And how do you do that in, I guess I'll just pass it over to you to talk about the difference between, being nice and cordial with people versus having friends where you can have those important, impactful conversations to grow and improve.
So that is the difference, right? Are you able to have real conversations? Are you able to be yourself? Are you able to speak up when something bothers you, when something isn't working for you? And if you're not, then, the Dalai Lama says holding anger and saying nothing is like drinking poison, hoping the other person will die. And so there is tension that's going to come up. Stuff's going to happen. And the question is, do you have the relationship and the tools that enable you to have these conversations when they come up? So if it's just nice, whether it's with your friends or whether it's with people with whom you work, it's not a real relationship. And so that's the spectrum through which I like to look at it, is can I be real? Can I be honest? Can I be myself? And that doesn't mean I'm going to tell you every little thing about me. There may be some things that are just absolutely inappropriate, but there's still room for vulnerability where people connect as human beings so they can see each other as people without judgment and understanding where they come from. The difficult conversation piece, a lot of people avoid those. I certainly lean towards being a conflict avoider, but after doing this work for so many years, I've realized how important it is to speak up when something isn't right, because it could simply be my misunderstanding. But if I say nothing and I keep misunderstanding, it's only going to drive a bigger wedge with that person.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm curious about when it comes to building impactful relationships and friendships at work. Can you talk about the dynamic that is with the power dynamic between potential like managers and employers? And are we looking to develop like strong friendship relationships there? And how do you have to kind of manage that when there's a power dynamic, I guess?
Yeah. That question comes to me often from CEOs who are considering launching a peer group program, or even just having a retreat where there's going to be some vulnerability. And some CEOs, certainly the ones who hire us, are comfortable knowing that's an important part and an important step in terms of building the relationships. The CEO himself, you go back to Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team, and he talks about building trust as the most important and first rung of the pyramid. And he says to do that, you have to get to know each other. And to do that, the CEO has to go first. So I get that question particularly from CEOs, and it kind of comes like this, Alex. It goes, wait a minute, how am I going to fire this person after becoming their friend if they're not performing? And my answer is, if you're being honest with them along the way, so they're not surprised, hopefully you won't have to fire them. And if you do have to fire them, they've heard your honest assessment of what it is they're not doing effectively for you every step of the way. And then hopefully they'll be reasonable to understand and they saw this train coming. It's just not working out. In the meantime, we could still be friends. Being friends doesn't mean I'm going to suffer that you aren't able to perform something.
Yeah, I think that's important to note and to realize. So what are some other things that leaders often get wrong when they're trying to build these strong personal relationships and at the same time demand this excellence from their people?
You know, one of the things I see is when the leaders think they're actually delegating authority and then they don't. So some leaders are much better at giving their people the rope, so to speak, to let them run. And some really struggle with it. And so when we have these honest conversations and people say to the leader, hey, you're micromanaging me. If the leader's not able to make that change and to give them that space, they're going to feel suffocated. And then they just may not stick around. So that is one thing that I see that also I would say can be a limit for how companies scale. If you're not able to delegate, then you're limited by the person who's kind of the bottleneck. And that's a problem for scaling up, as it were.
Yeah. Interesting. So what are some of the other like impactful activities that you kind of encourage organizations do to build these kind of relationships?
So I'll give you an example. I mean, when we first start with a client on this kind of a project, we always do a survey. And the survey is to all the participants because A, we want their input, and B, we want their buy-in from the start. And so after we've gotten this information, and there are questions like, how would you rate the level of trust? How would you rate the quality of relationships? How effectively do you handle difficult situations when they come up? And do you speak directly to the people with whom you have these issues? And do you think they speak directly to you? So we're really assessing the culture of the communication in the organization. And more than often than not, these questions don't come out, squeaky clean, right? Which is why somebody engaged us in the first place. And so then once we begin the session, we have to set the container. How do we agree to work together? What are the guidelines for how we are going to communicate today? And they're not my guidelines, it's the group's guidelines. So, they'll say things like confidentiality, they'll say things like non-judgment, they'll say things like listen, they'll say things like have fun. You know what? This doesn't have to be painful. But we'll make a list, and that list becomes the guiding principles for how we're going to operate. And I think that's an important piece of buy-in. I also think it's critical to get people to express their hopes so they hear each other. Because sometimes somebody, maybe even the CEO, thinks, well, that issue doesn't exist. And the survey may not even be enough to convince them. But when they hear it spoken in the room, it becomes undeniable. Now it's real, it's been said. So again, that's continuing the building and the buying in process, and that's important. After that, yeah.
Mo, I'm just curious if you can go a little bit deeper on that. You mentioned, you want the room to express their hopes, and then the CEO feels like might not be a problem that exists. Can you talk about how the hopes might shine light on the problems, just for clarity's sake?
Yeah, so one example that somebody might say in their hopes is, we have 2 new employees on this executive team, and we don't know them yet. And I hope to build a relationship with them. So that might be an example. Another example might be, I hope we have tools to address our difficult issues. because we have some conversations we've been avoiding. So those are some examples of things that might come up.
Okay, thank
And
you.
there are many more examples, but those are just two quick ones for you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So continuing, next thing is to do some sort of activity to break the ice. Something sometimes, easy, sometimes difficult. It depends on, the level of the group's advancement and how well I know them. But let's just say it's the first engagement. I like to break the ice with something like stand up if this is true for you or if that's true for you, and it helps people get to know each other really quickly. So it could be stand up if you're the oldest of your siblings, or if you're the youngest, or if you were kicked out of school, or if you were an athlete in school, or if you've ever been arrested. So some fun stuff, some meaningful stuff. It gets people engaged, it gets their blood flowing, gets them laughing. It gets them to feel some emotions, because I might also ask, stand up if you've come from a divorced household. And that gets people, to think about things that maybe they avoid talking about or avoid sharing. And visually, you could see in the room who has had similar experiences to you. So there's a connection already. So then another thing I might do is have people tell their life story. Again, it depends on the size of the group, but 10 minutes, tell your life story that made you who you are today. And so now people really understand each other. And that's just a powerful thing. Before that, I might talk about vulnerability and its importance. And again, I don't just preach. I ask the group, what does it mean to you? And then I ask the group, so why be vulnerable? And inevitably, somebody says, well, that's how you grow. And somebody else says, well, to unburden yourself. And somebody else says, to connect. How do you connect if you don't actually share your truth? And so people share these things, and it becomes obvious to the whole room why we're doing what we're going to do. And then the most important thing after all that is the clearing the air, the kind truth, how to have the difficult conversations, and maybe having people practice that either with fake situations or real situations if they have them.
Can you go a little bit deeper into the kind truth and what you mean by that?
Yeah. So it's how to say your truth that might create tension for you or for the person that you have to talk to. How to say your truth kindly. So too often when something is bothering us and we hold on to it, it gets pent up and it comes out in not such a nice way. And when that happens, it might feel like an attack. And the person on the receiving end might get defensive. And then they might even attack you back and say, well, here's what you did, or here's what you didn't do. And that's a typical chaotic conversation that doesn't always work. So we have a process, and the process is we're going to take turns. We're going to express how we feel. And the other person has to demonstrate hearing it so that we know we've closed the communication gap, the loop, and that everybody's on the same page. And that starts with different setup as well, of course. It depends on the level of contention the group has. So if I'm going into an organization where I know there's a lot of problems and people get fiery, then we'll start with a conversation about how do we have this conversation in a way that's going to be safe and effective. What are the responsibilities of both parties? So if I'm the sender of the message, what are my responsibilities? And if you're the receiver, what are your responsibilities? And one of my favorites is the receiver seeing this conversation as a gift. Because whatever I'm doing that's pissing you off, Alex, I'm probably doing with 100 other people. And for you to take the time, the courage, and the vulnerability to tell me, here's what you did, Mo, that bothered me, is actually a gift. It's an opportunity. It's a place where I see something I may not have seen about myself. And I have a chance to correct it, improve.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. And I'm just curious, how often do you recommend teams kind of go through this kind of practice, have these kind of conversations and these exercises with a group?
So I would say with a facilitator, once a quarter is ideal because it just wears off. And so we want to keep it going. Without a facilitator, once a week, at least have the conversation about, are we clean? And making sure the kind truth opportunities exist. Because again, we don't want to let things fester.
Are there other types of peer groups that you recommend, organizations take a look at or consider to build these kind of relationships at all levels of the organization?
Yeah, let me give you some examples because we've done a lot of this work in a lot of different places with many wonderful organizations. For Google, we did peer groups for underrepresented minorities. And it was during the time of the pandemic, so people were socially isolated and working from home. And it was really profound, particularly to hear some people say, I just started working there a month ago, and this is my first opportunity to actually connect with some coworkers. So anyway, that was one example. Another example, we have a client called Pathstone, and they're just one of my favorite companies. They're so cool. They manage family offices in a variety of different ways, provide different services to them. And they're just growing like weeds. They've got $40 billion under management. And what they do is we have peer groups. Every time we've acquired a company, we've put together peer groups to help merge the culture between the parent company and the new acquired company. And then we've created a peer group for next generation leaders. So these are people that are perceived to be up and coming leaders in the organization. And in 10 years, they're going to be running the organization. And so we have a peer group for that group of people. There's 10 of them, plus the CEO and the president. Just to go back to your original point, can the boss be in there, so to speak? And it's been brilliant. We've been meeting every month in this case, virtually, and because they're spread throughout the country anyway. So it allows them to connect in a meaningful way for people that wouldn't even see each other on a daily basis. And so that's another example that I think is really, really cool.
Really like that example, and kind of segues well into my next question, which is about the role of learning and development. So obviously with these next generation leaders, the idea of this peer group, I assume, is to help them build the skill sets and the tools and the resources that are going to be necessary to take on that next level of leadership. And I'm curious if you've seen in other examples of like learning groups that have been effective and ways that peers can encourage each other to learn and develop and build their own capacities.
I mean, that is 1,000% bang on what these groups are for. I mean, you obviously end up building supportive communities and friendships in some cases, lifelong friendships in some cases. But at the core of it, it's about learning. And so, part of the process in these peer groups is each meeting, somebody, or maybe two, maybe three people will present a challenge or an opportunity. And they get feedback, experience sharing, to be precise, from the rest of the group. And when that happens, everybody in the room has just heard 10 case studies about this topic. And so the learning is incredible, but it's also very practical and real, because you could Google, I've got a cash flow problem, and Google will give you an answer. But, I think it helps to hear the actual story from somebody of, here's what I tried, and here's what what worked, and here's what didn't work. And you get some things that maybe Google doesn't even realize, and there are other options out there. And so it's a profound learning opportunity. And I think part of the benefit of these peer groups is providing a built-in mechanism for companies to continually learn, to have people continually learn. And learn what they want to learn, right? So it's not a push. Yeah. It's not a push learning module. It is what people need to learn to address specific issues that they're facing.
Do you find that these peer groups have the attendees pushing each other to build capacity, and are they holding each other accountable to the the growth and capacity goals that they have? Like, I'm curious if peers can do that, or if that kind of growth and that pushing to succeed needs to come from a leader or a manager or the CEO. What have you seen?
It absolutely comes from peers.
Okay.
Listen, it certainly can come from president or manager or CEO, but it absolutely comes from peers. I think about my own group of friends, or I think about my own peer group, which I've been a part of since 1991. And I think about where we were 30 years ago and where we are today, either group, and the growth that we've had is absolutely astounding. And to say it's by fluke, I don't know. Like, when you're hanging out with the right people and watching them do all sorts of cool things, you have to look in the mirror and say, what am I doing? And it's not forced accountability in the groups that we work with. Accountability certainly is more important for some groups than others. And in our case, it's self-accountability, but it's also knowing I'm going to go back to my group next month and look them in the face and say, here's what happened with my issue, or here's what didn't happen with my issue. So yes, it's intrinsically built in.
Thank you. So we've only got about 3 minutes left, but I want to ask you, what are you seeing in terms of the future of work? What do you see continuing to shift as it relates to relationships and forums and peer groups moving into, the rest of 2023 and beyond? Obviously, technology is going crazy. The landscape of business is changing. What's your take on what we can expect in the future?
I'll start with the down note, and I think people are just still struggling right now from backlash from the pandemic and the mental health challenges that have crept up and increased. But aside from that, there's much more readiness, willingness, acceptance, understanding of the value of bringing your whole self to work. Emotional intelligence, vulnerability, connection, friendship. Those things are at a far, far, far better place in the corporate workplace than they were 30 years ago when I started doing this work. So I think we're going in the right direction. I think companies are realizing the importance of having to focus on all that. And I think I could just say, hooray, it's about time.
Fantastic. Well, Mo, any last comments or thoughts before we say goodbye to our community today?
Well, it's a pleasure being with you as always. Great questions, and I love this conversation, and I love hearing that I see the effect this work is having on the community out there, because I think we need to get people to a better place. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mo. It's always a pleasure getting to learn from you and connect with you. And thank you to our community for joining us live today. And we'll see you all again next week. Take care.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.